She threw wine in this king's face in front of every noble in the kingdom, and nobody stopped her. Not because they didn't want to, not because they weren't horrified, but because deep down, every soul in that glittering hall knew she was right. What they didn't know, what Kyle Draven himself didn't know, was that by sunrise, the woman he had just humiliated in front of his entire court would be gone, taken, carried across the border into the hands of the one man who had spent years waiting for exactly this moment. And the king who thought he needed no one would ride into the dark, willing to bleed and die, for the girl he'd spent a decade pretending not to love. This is that story. Stay until the end, like this video, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. The northern frontier was no place for softness. It said so in the way the wind came off the Ashen Vale Mountains. Not as a breeze, not as a gust, but as a statement, a flat declaration that the world up here operated by different rules. Snow arrived in early October and stayed until May. The stone walls of Draven Citadel were 4 feet thick at their narrowest point, built not for beauty, but for survival. Each tower angled to deflect the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, but reached inside your ribcage and squeezed. The forests beyond the outer wall were ancient and dark, the kind of dark that swallowed torchlight without apology. And yet Rowan Vale had loved it here from the first morning she remembered waking up. She was 6 years old when her father, Lord Aldrich Vale, was appointed the king's border steward, the man responsible for managing the contested territories between the Draven Kingdom and the wild lands to the north where no crown held sway. It was not a glamorous posting. It was cold, remote, and dangerous. Most noblemen of Aldrich's station lobbied desperately to avoid it. Aldrich Vale had volunteered. "The frontier is where the real work happens," he told his daughter, on the morning their carriage rolled through the citadel's iron gates for the first time. "Any man can manage peace in a warm palace. It takes something different to hold the line out here." Rowan had pressed her face against the frosted carriage window and stared at the inner yard where 2 boys were sparring with wooden swords in the snow. One was tall for his age, dark-haired, and moved with the kind of natural authority that came not from training but from somewhere deeper. Like his body already understood what his mind was still learning. The other boy was smaller, quicker, and laughed when the taller one knocked him down. The taller boy did not laugh. He reached down and offered his hand. "Who is that?" Rowan asked. Her father glanced out the window. Something shifted in his expression. Something careful. "That," he said quietly, "is Prince Kael." She met him officially 3 days later in the Citadel's Great Hall, where the king's household gathered for the mid-autumn feast. Protocol demanded she curtsy. She did. Protocol did not demand that she then look the prince directly in the eye and say, without any of the preamble a 6-year-old was supposed to use when addressing royalty, "I saw you sparring yesterday. You telegraph your left swing." The hall went very quiet. Lord Aldrich's face went the color of old ash. The prince, 8 years old, already carrying himself like he owned the air around him, stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, one corner of his mouth pulled upward. "Show me," he said. What followed was not appropriate by any standard of court behavior. It involved 2 children commandeering a pair of training swords from a deeply alarmed squire, moving the feast tables aside over the protests of 3 stewards, and conducting an impromptu demonstration that lasted 20 minutes and ended with both of them breathless on the stone floor, grinning at each other like they'd just discovered a secret the rest of the world didn't know about. Kael Draven won the bout, but only because Rowan let him. She decided, in that moment, not to tell him that. The years that followed were the kind that memory polishes to a shine, not because they were perfect, but because they were real in a way that life rarely manages again once you grow up and learn to be afraid. They trained together every morning in the Citadel yard, regardless of weather, regardless of season. Rowan grew faster. Kael grew stronger. She learned to read his fighting style the way a musician learns a piece of music. She knew where he would hesitate, where he would overcommit, where the pride that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat would push him into a swing he shouldn't take. He learned that she would always find the angle he wasn't watching, and that the only way to beat her was to be unpredictable, which was the one thing that did not come naturally to him. They raced through the snowy courtyards on winter mornings when the rest of the citadel was still sleeping, their breath coming in white clouds, their boots throwing up sprays of ice. They climbed the eastern tower, technically forbidden to anyone below the rank of sworn knight, so many times that the guards stopped pretending they hadn't seen. They found a library in the citadel's lower levels that nobody else seemed to use, full of old maps and older books, and they spent rainy afternoons there talking about the territories on those maps as though they were planning campaigns, as though the world was a puzzle they were going to solve together. "When I'm king," Kael said once, lying on his stomach on the library floor with a map spread out in front of him, "I'm going to push the border back 50 miles north. The Highland clans have been raiding the farmlands for 2 generations. My father keeps trying to negotiate." "And you don't think negotiation works?" Rowan sat cross-legged beside him, her chin in her hands. "Not with people who respect strength over words." He traced the map with one finger. "You have to meet them on terms they understand. Or," she said, "you could figure out why they keep raiding and deal with that instead." He looked at her. "That's a softer approach. It's a smarter approach. Strength wins battles. Understanding wins wars." He was quiet for a long moment, then, "You know, you're going to make a terrible courtier." "Probably," she agreed. "I intend to." He smiled, not the careful, composed expression he wore in public, but the real one, the one that reached his eyes, the one that was only ever for her. "Good," he said quietly. "I have enough courtiers." She fell in love with him the way you fall into deep water when you don't realize the ledge has ended. Not dramatically, not with a thunderclap or a revelation, but gradually and then all at once. She was 11. He was 13. It was nothing she chose and everything she couldn't undo. She didn't tell him. Of course she didn't. She was Lord Aldrich's daughter, not a great house heir, not a political asset, not the kind of name that appeared on lists when people discussed the king's future. She understood the world she lived in well enough to know that feelings, however real, required the right architecture to stand on. Hers had none. So she kept it where she kept everything difficult, somewhere deep and quiet, somewhere it couldn't interfere with what she actually had, which was his friendship, his trust, and the mornings in the training yard where none of the titles mattered, and they were just 2 people trying to best each other in the snow. It was enough. She told herself every day that it was enough. Then Kael's father died. It happened in the early spring of Kael's 14th year, a fever that came fast and left nothing. One week the old king was presiding over court. 3 weeks later he was buried in the royal crypts, and Kael Draven stood in the great hall in front of every lord and soldier in the northern territories, a crown that was slightly too large placed on his head and accepted the weight of an entire kingdom. Rowan stood in the crowd and watched his face during the ceremony. She watched the moment it happened. The moment the boy she knew stepped back, like a tide going out, and something older and harder moved in to fill the space. His jaw set, his shoulders squared. His eyes, which had always moved when she looked into them, full of restless thought and barely contained humor, went still. He was 14 years old, and he had just become a different person. She watched it happen and couldn't stop it, and didn't know how to grieve something that was still standing right in front of her. The first year of his reign was chaos, and it was in that chaos that the distance began. Kael was surrounded, every hour of every day, by advisors and lords and ambassadors and military commanders, all of them men twice his age, all of them with opinions about how the young king should conduct himself. He needed to project strength. He needed to be decisive. He needed to demonstrate immediately and continuously that his father's death had not created an opening for challengers. There was no room in any of that for a 13-year-old girl who outran him in the courtyards and corrected his tactical assumptions in the library. She understood. She even agreed with the logic, in the abstract, the way you can understand why something necessary is also painful. But understanding a thing doesn't make it hurt less. The mornings in the training yard stopped. Not suddenly. There was no announcement, no conversation, just a gradual trailing off as his schedule filled with things that didn't include her. The library afternoons ended. The races through the snow became a memory she took out occasionally, turned over in her hands, and put carefully back. He was always civil when they interacted at court, more than civil. He was precise and appropriate and exactly what a king was supposed to be with a nobleman's daughter. He asked after her father's health. He remembered her opinions on frontier policy and occasionally referenced them in meetings, though never by name. He was considerate and distant and perfect, and it was like being handed a photograph of someone you loved instead of the person themselves. He's doing what he has to do, she told herself, the first 100 times. He's a king. He can't afford... And then she would stop, because she couldn't quite finish that sentence without something breaking. She was 21 when she understood that waiting had become its own kind of trap. She had grown, in the years since his coronation, into exactly what she'd once promised not to be, a courtier. A good one, actually. She'd inherited her father's political instincts and sharpened them with years of observation, and she'd built a quiet but genuine reputation as someone whose analysis could be trusted. Lords consulted her. Ambassadors sought her opinion. She was useful, respected, and thoroughly exhaustingly invisible to the one person whose attention she actually wanted. She watched Kyle from across council tables and great halls and formal dinners, and she learned him in a new way, the way you learn someone you can no longer touch. She knew the specific set of his jaw that meant he was annoyed but too controlled to show it. She knew the half-second pause before he laughed at something, the space where he decided whether a thing was safe enough to find funny. She knew when his advisor, Harmon Greer, was pushing him somewhere he didn't want to go, because his right thumb would press against his ring finger, a gesture so small she doubted anyone else had ever noticed it. She knew him better than anyone at court. She was almost certain he didn't know she was still watching. The Moonbond Ball was a tradition that predated the Draven dynasty by 3 centuries. Every year, on the last full moon of autumn, the court gathered for the grandest event in the northern calendar. It was part celebration, part ceremony, a night when old alliances were renewed and new ones announced, when marriages were formalized and heirs presented, and for as long as anyone could remember, it had served as the occasion when an unmarried alpha king would formally signal his choice of mate, not with an announcement, but with a dance. Whoever the king led to the floor first, whoever he guided through the first waltz, had been chosen. The court had been alive with speculation for weeks. Kyle was 23, 7 years into his reign, and the question of succession had moved from a distant concern to an immediate one. The lords were restless. The ambassadors were attentive. Every eligible noblewoman within 3 kingdoms had begun arriving at Draven Citadel with their best gowns and their most carefully rehearsed conversations. Rowan watched them arrive and told herself with considerable conviction that she felt nothing at all about any of it. She was lying. She had become quite skilled at it. Lord Aldrich, who saw more than he usually let on, found her in the lower library 3 nights before the ball. She was sitting at the table with a book she hadn't turned a page of in an hour, and he sat across from her and said nothing for a long time, which was his way of saying everything. "He's going to choose Lady Serena Ashford," Rowan said finally, "or possibly Mira Vandel. Either one is a strong political alliance." Her father looked at her. "Is that what you believe, or is that what you're preparing yourself for?" She didn't answer. "Rowan," his voice was gentle, "you have been carrying something heavy for a very long time." "I'm fine, Father. I know you are." He paused. But fine isn't the same as whole. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "The worst outcome is not being rejected. The worst outcome is spending your life wondering what might have happened if you'd been brave." She stared at the unread page for a long time after he left. He was right. She hated that he was right. She made the decision somewhere around midnight, sitting alone in a library that smelled of old paper and pine smoke, with the wind throwing itself against the stone walls outside. She would tell him. Before the ball, before the dancing, before whatever public statement he was about to make that would close the door she'd been standing beside for 8 years. She would find him. She would say the words she'd been swallowing since she was 11 years old. And then, whatever he said back, at least she would know. The next morning, she went looking for him. The Citadel was 3 days from the ball and operating at maximum chaos. Servants everywhere, carts of food and flowers clogging the corridors, lords she didn't recognize arriving every hour, with entourages that spilled through the gates in disorganized waves. She moved through it all with purpose, asking carefully worded questions of the right people, building a picture of where he was. He was in the East Wing, she was told, meeting with the heads of 3 border houses. It would last until midday. She waited. She waited in a small alcove near the East Wing's main corridor, in a chair that was not comfortable, with a book she was genuinely reading this time. And she waited through the sound of raised voices from the meeting room and the smell of candle smoke and the particular quality of light that northern mornings had, gray and clear and very cold. And then she heard, from around the corner, the sound of his voice. Not the measured public voice. The real one, lower and less careful. The one she still heard sometimes in her dreams. The one that meant she had gotten past the walls. He was talking to someone, and she was about to stand, about to round the corner, about to begin the most terrifying conversation of her adult life. And then she heard what he was saying. Don't understand why you're defending her, Marcus. She doesn't need protecting. Marcus Hale's voice, even and steady as always. I'm not protecting her. I'm telling you what I observed. Rowan was upset about the Vandel announcement. I offered her a conversation. A conversation? Something in Cale's tone was strange, clipped, compressed, like he was holding something too tightly. In the Eastern Garden, for an hour. Sire. She had her hand on your arm. A pause. She was cold. I gave her my cloak. Marcus. His voice had dropped, something in it that she couldn't identify. I need to know if there is something between you and Lady Rowan that I should be aware of. Rowan's hand pressed flat against the stone wall. There is nothing between myself and Lady Vale beyond friendship and mutual respect, Marcus said carefully. The same friendship and respect, I believe, that she has always had for you, which you might consider before you... That's enough. The king's voice had gone smooth and unreadable, the voice he used when a conversation was over. We'll speak no more of it. Footsteps. Moving away. Rowan stood in the alcove and breathed very slowly and thought about what she had just heard. Jealousy. That was the thing in his voice she hadn't recognized immediately because she had not let herself believe it was possible. But she'd heard him angry before, and this was not anger. It was something closer to fear. She turned that over. She examined it carefully, from all sides, and then she decided she still needed to find him, even more urgently now. She found him in the library. Of course she did. The lower library, where they had spent 100 rainy afternoons over maps and old books, making plans for a world that neither of them owned yet. She didn't know if he'd gone there deliberately, but she suspected he had. Some things went deep enough into a person that they didn't need to be conscious decisions. He was standing at the far window when she came in, looking out at the gray morning, and he turned when he heard her footsteps. Something crossed his face, too fast to catch, before it settled back into the careful composure she'd spent years learning to look through. Rowan. His voice was perfectly neutral. I wasn't aware you were looking for me. I was, she said. I've been trying to find you all morning. He moved to the nearest table and picked up a document that he didn't look at. It was, she recognized, a performance of occupation, of having better things to do. She'd seen him use it in council meetings when someone was pressing a point he didn't want to engage with. She ignored it. I need to say something, she said. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Can you do that? He looked at her then. Not the polished court look, but the real one. Slightly wary, slightly hungry, like he wasn't sure whether to step forward or back. I'll try, he said. She took a breath. Everything she'd rehearsed dissolved. She had prepared words, organized arguments, a structure for this conversation that would make it manageable and survivable. None of it was available now. What came out instead was the truth, raw and unorganized, and almost certainly tactically disastrous. I love you, she said. I have loved you since I was 11 years old, and I have never stopped. And I know that is inconvenient, and I know it is not what you need right now, and I know there are 20 women in the Citadel who are better political choices than I am. But I watched you walk toward that ball, and I realized that if I let this happen without saying it, if I just stood in the crowd and watched you choose someone else without ever telling you, I would not forgive myself. So, she stopped, swallowed. That's what I came to say. The library was very quiet. Cale was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something undone about it. Something that made him look, suddenly, much younger than his 23 years, much closer to the boy in the snow with the wooden sword who had looked at her and said, "Show me." He took one step toward her. Then he stopped himself. The composure came back. Not all at once. She watched it return piece by piece, like armor being put back on. The jaw, the shoulders, the eyes going careful again. "Rowan, you don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "I told you I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know." "Rowan," his voice was rough in a way she'd never heard from him. "You have no idea." He stopped, started again. "This isn't the time." "You keep saying that." She hadn't meant to say that. It came out anyway. "You have been saying some version of that for 8 years." Because it's true. And now there was heat in his voice. Real heat, the kind that lived underneath all the control. "I have a kingdom to protect. The ball in 3 days is not a party. It's a political event. And every choice I make in that hall will be analyzed for weaknesses by men who are waiting for me to—" "I know," she said. "I know what it costs. I'm not asking you to set down the crown." "Aren't you?" The question hit her like cold water. She looked at him. He was looking back. And in the space between them, years of unsaid things were pressing against both sides, and she could feel the exact fragility of this moment. One wrong word, in either direction, would shatter it. "No," she said, very quietly. "I'm asking you to let me stand beside it." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. She didn't move. He stopped with barely 2 feet between them, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. The old battle between what he felt and what he believed he was allowed to feel, between the boy she'd known and the king he'd made himself into. And then he kissed her. It was not a careful kiss. It was not a polished, composed, royal gesture. It was the kind of kiss that accumulated when you'd swallowed something for 8 years and then stopped, urgent and searching and absolutely without pretense. And she met it the same way, both hands gripping the front of his jacket because her knees had decided this was not a situation they needed to be structural about. For approximately 10 seconds, the library was the only place in the world. Then she felt him pull back. She opened her eyes. His forehead was against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing unsteady. She could feel his hands where they'd come to rest on either side of her jaw. "Rowan." His voice was very quiet. "I can't do this right now." She stepped back, not dramatically, not with words. She simply stepped back, out of his hands, and let the cold air close the space between them, and looked at him with the very last of her composure doing the work it was built to do. "I know," she said. She left. She walked out of the library and down the corridor and into the gray northern morning, and she breathed very carefully the entire way, and she told herself that she was fine, and this time she almost believed it. Almost. What she didn't know, as she walked back through the citadel to begin the 3 most painful days of her recent memory, was that she had been seen. Not the kiss. Nobody had been in the library but the 2 of them. But she had been seen leaving, expression carefully neutral, jaw set, movements with that particular precision that came from emotional damage being carefully managed. She had been seen by 2 people who were watching the Citadel's movements very closely. One was Marcus Hale, who saw her and understood approximately everything, and whose face held a sadness he kept very quiet. The other was a man she didn't recognize, but compact, well-dressed, with the kind of face that was designed to not be noticed. He stood near a window in an adjacent corridor, a glass of wine in his hand, looking like a minor lord killing time before dinner. He was not a minor lord. His name was Renwick, and he worked for a man across the border who had been waiting for exactly this kind of information. He watched Rowan Vale walk down the corridor with her chin up and her hands steady, and her heart, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look, thoroughly breaking. He set down his wine. He went to write a letter. The night before the ball, Rowan lay awake in her chambers and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind. The wind here had a sound she'd known her whole life, a low, continuous pressure against the stone, like something vast and patient leaning against the walls. She had slept through it 1,000 times. Tonight, it kept her awake. She thought about what had happened in the library. She turned it over with the methodical care she brought to tactical problems, examining each piece, each word, each fraction of a second. He had kissed her. He had pulled back. He had said he couldn't do this right now. Right now was doing a lot of work in that sentence. It could mean not yet, but eventually. It could mean not in this political moment, but in a different one. It could mean I feel this too, but I need time to figure out how to hold it without dropping everything else. It could also mean not ever, but I don't know how to say that. She had been trained by years of watching court politics to read the space between what people said and what they meant. She was usually good at it. Tonight, with him, she wasn't sure she trusted herself to be objective. She got up before dawn and went to the training yard. The yard was empty in the dark, lit only by a pair of torches that the overnight guard had left burning. The snow had a crust on it from yesterday's freeze. She moved through her forms alone in the cold, working through the sequence she'd learned at 7 years old and refined continuously since, not because she needed to, but because movement was the only thing that reliably quieted the inside of her head. She was halfway through the third form when she heard footsteps. She didn't stop moving. She knew the sound of his walk. He came and stood at the edge of the yard and watched her finish. When she lowered her sword, she turned to face him. In the torchlight, his expression was difficult to read. Too much shadow, too much control. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "No." "Me neither." A long pause. Wind, the creak of the torch bracket. "I owe you an answer," he said. Her chest tightened. "You don't." "I do." He stepped forward, and she made herself hold still. "What you said yesterday, what I did. You deserve a real answer, not—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "Not me running from it." She waited. "The ball tomorrow," he said carefully. "What it means. The political reality." He exhaled. "I've been telling myself those things were why I couldn't—" Another stop. "Why I've been telling you it's not the time." "And?" she asked, very quietly. "And I think," he said, and his voice had something raw in it that she'd never heard there before, not even in the library, "that I've been hiding behind them." The night was very still. "Kyle, there are things I need to figure out," he said, "about what I can offer, about whether I know how to—" He struggled with it. "I have spent 9 years making myself into what a king is supposed to be. I'm not sure I know anymore where that ends and where I—" He stopped again. "I need to think." "I know," she said. "After the ball." She nodded. "After the ball." He looked at her for a moment longer. That undone expression again, underneath all the layers of composed authority. Then he inclined his head, turned, and walked back toward the citadel. Rowan stood in the empty training yard and breathed cold air and looked at the place where he'd been standing. After the ball, she told herself. One more day. She went back to her chambers. She did not sleep. She began, with the careful practicality that had always been her strongest attribute, to prepare for whatever came next. She could not have known that the next day would not go the way she planned, that the moment she'd been building toward would be swallowed by something larger and uglier and entirely outside her control. She could not have known that by the time the ball ended, she would be gone, but that was still hours away. For now she was in her chambers, in a stone fortress on the edge of the world, watching the gray light of a northern dawn begin to press against the window. The wind was still leaning on the walls, patient and constant, as though it had all the time there was. She was 21 years old and in love with a king, and terrified and brave in equal measure, and she was about to walk into the worst night of her life not knowing it was coming. Some things, she would later think, are probably better that way. The dawn came slow and cold over the Ashen Vale Mountains, painting the snow outside her window in shades of iron and pale gold. She watched it rise, and she waited. The ball began at sundown. By the time the great hall's doors were thrown open and the first wave of nobles swept through in their silks and their careful smiles, Draven Citadel had transformed itself into something that barely resembled the stone fortress Rowan had grown up inside. Someone, presumably the head steward, a precise man named Godwin, who treated every event as a military campaign, had hung 1,000 candles from iron chandeliers the size of carriage wheels, filling the hall with a warm amber light that made everything look softer than it was. The long tables had been replaced by a cleared floor of polished dark stone, ringed by smaller tables draped in midnight blue and silver, the Draven colors. At the far end of the hall, the dais where Kael's throne normally sat had been fitted with a raised platform for the musicians, and they were already playing, something low and elaborate, a northern court piece that moved like weather. Rowan arrived alone. She had dressed without assistance, which was a choice, and also, if she was being honest, a mild act of stubbornness. The women of her rank were expected to arrive, attended, fussed over, presented. She had spent the afternoon in her chambers with a book she still wasn't reading, and when the candles outside her window told her it was time, she had dressed herself in the dark green gown she'd brought for this occasion. Not the finest in the hall, not trying to be, but well-made and well-fitted and exactly right for the person wearing it. And she had put her hair up herself, and she had walked to the great hall alone because she needed, at least in the walking, to belong entirely to herself. The hall took her in the way great halls do, swallowing her into the noise and light and press of bodies, turning her from a solitary person into a piece of the larger gathering. She found a spot near one of the outer tables with a clear line of sight to the room and accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant and let herself simply watch. The nobility of the North was on full display tonight. She catalogued it automatically, the way she always did. Not from coldness, but from the particular kind of attention that had been her main tool since childhood. Lord Harwick of the Eastern Vale, deep in conversation with two men she recognized as the Vandal family's senior advisors. Lady Serena Ashford, positioned with exquisite precision near the room's center in a gown the color of winter ice, surrounded by 3 other women who were orbiting her like satellites. Ambassador Crane from the Southern Territories, who had been at Draven Citadel for 6 weeks, and whose interest in the evening's outcome went considerably beyond diplomatic courtesy. And Marcus Hale, standing at the room's edge with a cup he wasn't drinking from, watching the door. She liked Marcus. She had always liked Marcus. There was a steadiness to him, a quality of paying attention without judgment that she respected. He was 3 years older than Kael, had been his beta since before the coronation, and had the rare gift of being completely trustworthy without being completely predictable. When he caught her eye across the room, he nodded, and she nodded back, and that was its own small conversation. He looked, she thought, worried. She didn't have time to consider why, because the musicians shifted into a more formal piece, and the crowd parted, and Kyle Draven walked into the hall. But he wore the Draven colors without excess. No crown for events like this, just the silver-clasped jacket over dark wool, the kind of dressed authority that didn't need to announce itself. He moved through the parting crowd with the ease of someone who had spent 9 years learning to make every room feel like it was his, which it was, and he was speaking with Lord Harwick before he'd taken 20 steps inside, managing 3 separate conversations at once with the fluency of long practice. He had not looked in her direction. She told herself this was fine. It was a crowded room, and he had obligations, and she was one of 100 people in attendance, and there was absolutely nothing significant about the fact that he had not. He looked at her. Across the room, through the press of candlelit bodies, directly at her. For 2 full seconds, nothing moved in his face except his eyes, which were doing something complicated that she felt rather than read. Then someone touched his arm. Lord Harwick, redirecting. And he turned, and the moment closed like a door. Rowan took a careful sip of her wine. After the ball, he had said. She was going to hold him to that. Ooh. The first hour passed in the way that these events passed when you were waiting for something, thick and slow, time moving through amber rather than air. She spoke with people she knew, maintained conversations that were pleasant and entirely forgettable, moved through the room without purpose, and with the appearance of having plenty of it. She watched the political machinery of the evening operate around her, alliances signaled by where people stood, proximity used like currency, every laugh and offered hand a calculation dressed as feeling. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Tonight it required more of her than usual. Around the second hour, she found herself near the hall's eastern alcove, an arched space set into the wall where the noise of the room was muffled slightly, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of simply standing still and breathing. The wine had settled into a mild warmth somewhere behind her sternum. The musicians were playing something slower now. "You look like someone who has decided something." She turned. Marcus Hale had materialized beside her with the quiet efficiency that was his particular talent. He was holding a fresh cup of wine, which he offered her. She accepted it mostly because it gave her hands something to do. "I look like someone standing in an alcove," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He leaned against the wall beside her, surveying the room with the same professional attention she'd been giving it. "How are you?" "Fine." "Rowan." "I'm managing," she amended. "Which is as honest as I can be right now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "He's going to do something tonight. I don't know what exactly, but I've watched him all day, and he's off. Something happened." She looked at the room rather than at Marcus. "I know." "He spoke to me yesterday," Marcus said, "about you." A pause. "About what he thought he saw in the Eastern Garden." "He was wrong about what he saw." "I know that. I told him that." Marcus's voice was even, but something moved underneath it. "He heard me. I'm not certain he believed me." He turned his head slightly toward her. "He is not, despite significant evidence to the contrary, particularly rational about you." She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and sharper. "That's one way to describe it." "Rowan." He turned to face her more directly, and she recognized the shift. Marcus becoming less diplomatic, more direct, which he only did when he thought it was genuinely necessary. "Whatever is happening between you and him, tonight is not a stable environment for it. He is wound very tight, and the court is watching everything. And I know," she said again, "I'm not planning to make a scene." "I know you're not." He hesitated. "I'm not sure the same can be said for him." She looked at Marcus then. His expression was careful, not alarmed, but something adjacent to it. "What does that mean?" she asked. He looked out at the room, at the king, visible across the hall, moving from one group of lords to the next with his practiced ease. "It means," Marcus said slowly, "that in the 9 years I have served him, I have never seen him look at someone the way he looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching. And I have also never seen him more capable of doing something reckless with that feeling than he is tonight." The music changed. The waltz. The formal waltz. The signal that the evening ceremony was beginning, that the king would shortly take the floor, that the choice would be made. Rowan set down her wine cup very carefully on the ledge beside her. "I need to go," she said. "Rowan." But she was already moving, stepping back into the body of the hall, because she needed to see this, needed to watch it with her eyes open and her spine straight, and all the dignity she had available to her, because whatever happened next, she was going to face it standing up. The waltz protocol required the king to take the floor first and wait. Then the woman of his choice would join him. Kael walked to the center of the hall with the particular gravity of official ceremony, and the crowd arranged itself around the edges of the dance floor with the practiced efficiency of people who had attended this event before. The musicians sustained a single held note. Rowan stood in the crowd and watched his back and felt the entire room breathe in. He turned. His eyes found her immediately. Not Lady Ashford, not any of the women who had been positioned within easy reach for exactly this moment. Her. The look lasted 1 second, maybe 2, and in it was everything they hadn't said in the library, everything she'd spent the night before turning over, all of it visible for a single, unguarded moment on the face of a man who spent his life making sure nothing showed. Then something else moved across his face, and she realized, with the sinking that started in her chest and moved outward, that Marcus had been right. Something was wrong. He was looking past her, or rather, she turned slightly, following the direction of his gaze. He was looking at where she'd just come from, the eastern alcove, where she'd been standing with Marcus, close enough together that anyone watching from across the room would have seen 2 people deep in private conversation. Her leaning against the wall, his body angled toward hers, the posture of intimacy that was actually the posture of concern, but that red, from 20 feet away in candlelight, as something else entirely. Oh no, she thought. It happened fast. Kael's expression closed, not gradually, all at once, like a shutter dropping. The openness she'd seen there, the 2 seconds of something real and unguarded, vanished as if it had never been. What replaced it was the most dangerous face she had ever seen him wear. Not anger, not exactly, but the cold, controlled expression of a man who had decided that whatever he was feeling was not acceptable and had rerouted it into something else. He turned his head. He spoke to Lord Harwick, who was standing nearest to him. She was too far away to hear it, but she could hear, a moment later, when Harwick, clearly surprised, said, loud enough to carry to the nearest cluster of guests, "Lady Vandel, are you certain, sire?" The crowd shifted. Mira Vandel, a blonde woman in pale gold near the north side of the hall, looked up with an expression of genuine shock that transformed rapidly into composed pleasure. She began moving toward the dance floor. Rowan stood completely still. He's doing it deliberately, she thought, not choosing Vandel because Vandel was the right choice, doing it because he'd looked across the room, seen what he thought he saw, and punished himself for letting his guard down in the library yesterday. Punished himself and her in the same motion. It was the most specific kind of cruelty, the kind that wasn't really cruelty, the kind that came from a person trying very hard not to want something and failing at it badly. She understood it completely. She also could not stand here and watch it happen. She turned. She began moving toward the edge of the hall, toward the door, toward the cold outside air that would be a great deal more honest than any of this. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when she heard his voice. Not quiet, not private. The carrying voice. The deliberate one. The one that filled rooms. Lady Vale. She stopped. Around her, the conversations nearest to her went quiet in the spreading silence of a stone dropped in still water. She turned. He was still standing in the center of the dance floor. Mira Vandel now paused halfway across the room, the whole hall holding its breath. He was looking at Rowan with that closed, controlled expression, and there was something behind it. She knew him well enough to see it, even now. That was not what the expression was pretending to be. "I couldn't help but notice," he said, and his voice had a pleasantness to it that was sharp at the edges, "that you and Beta Hale had much to discuss this evening. I hope the conversation was sufficiently entertaining." The silence went very deep. She knew what he was doing. She had watched him do this to political opponents in council chambers. Take something private and expose it in public, use the social calculus of the room as pressure. She had watched it work every time. She had even, in the past, felt a distant professional appreciation for how effective it was. From the inside, it felt like standing in the center of a room while the walls moved in. Every face she could see in her peripheral vision was watching her, some with pity, some with the barely concealed attention of people who had been waiting for drama. Lady Ashford, somewhere behind her, with a satisfaction she wasn't quite hiding. Rowan stood still for one breath. 2. She had a choice. She could be gracious, she could deflect, she could smile and produce a courtier's response that gave him nothing to work with, and walked herself out of the room with her reputation intact and her blood pressure elevated and her heart continuing to break in the same quiet way it had been breaking for 8 years. She had been gracious her entire adult life. Her hand moved. She didn't decide it, or she decided it the way you decide to breathe after holding your breath too long. Not a choice so much as a necessary end to holding. Her hand found the wine glass on the table beside her, and she picked it up, and she walked back across the floor toward the king with every eye in the hall following her, and she stopped 2 feet in front of him. She looked at him. His expression had shifted. Surprise, quickly controlled, something else she didn't have time to read. She threw the wine in his face. The deep red of it arced through the candlelight in a single brilliant splash. It hit him across the jaw and chest. The glass stayed in her hand. The hall made a sound, a collective intake of breath so unified it sounded like a single person. "My conversation with Beta Hale," she said, and her voice was very steady, much steadier than she felt, "was none of your concern. My evenings are none of your concern. I am not your property. I am not your subject in anything except name, and I will not stand in your hall while you use me as a target for whatever this is." Her free hand came up, open palm, She slapped him, not with violence, or not primarily with violence, with truth. The sharp kind, the kind that said, I see you, and I know what you just did, and I will not pretend it's acceptable. The sound of it was very loud in the silent hall. He didn't move. He stood absolutely still, wine on his jaw, red rising in his cheek where her hand had landed, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. You're welcome, she said quietly, and meant it, and turned and walked out of the hall. The courtyard outside was cold, really, seriously cold, the deep night northern cold that the citadel's walls usually blocked, pressing in from all directions, turning her breath to mist and making the stone beneath her feet feel like it had been carved from ice. She walked without direction for a moment, burning energy she didn't know what else to do with. And then she stopped near the eastern garden wall and stood with her back against the stone and pressed her palms flat against it and breathed. Her heart was doing something extraordinary. Her hands were shaking slightly. The aftermath of it, the adrenaline finding nowhere to go. She wasn't crying. She noted this with a kind of distant interest. She had expected to cry. She wasn't. What she felt more than anything was clear. She had said something true in front of a room full of people who rarely heard truth spoken aloud. And she had said it to the one person who most needed to hear it. And yes, it had been catastrophic. And yes, she would be navigating the consequences for a long time. But she could breathe right now in a way she hadn't been able to breathe in years. She heard footsteps. Not his. She knew his step, and this wasn't it. Lighter, faster, from the direction of the hall's side door. She turned. Marcus. Moving quickly, his expression stripped of its usual composure for once, something that looked very much like alarm occupying the space where steadiness normally lived. Rowan. He reached her and stopped. Are you all right? Surprisingly, yes. You need to come inside. His voice was low. Not the hall. Your chambers, now. She looked at him. Something in the quality of his alarm had shifted into something different, something focused and tight. Marcus, what's wrong? He glanced back toward the courtyard's other entrance. How long were you standing out here before I came? 2 minutes? Maybe 3. Why? Were you alone? She frowned. Yes. Why are you? There was someone watching the hall's exits tonight, he said. I noticed them an hour ago. 2 men, not Citadel guards, not regular staff. I thought they were House Vandel retainers, but I've been watching them and they don't move like retainers, and they've been paying specific attention to... He stopped, made a decision. We need to get you inside. She pushed off the wall. Marcus, talk to me. What are you saying? I'm saying, he said, and his voice was very controlled now, the voice he used when things were serious, that something is wrong in this citadel tonight that has nothing to do with the ball, and I think it is connected to you, and I am not going to stand here in an open courtyard and explain it when there are positions along that east wall that give a direct line of... A sound. Both of them went still. It came from the garden's far end. Not loud, not alarming in itself, just the specific sound of a stone scraping against stone. The kind of sound that happened when someone was moving carefully in the dark and being almost but not quite silent about it. Marcus moved first. He stepped in front of her, and she saw his hand go to the blade at his hip, and she felt the cold in the courtyard change quality, become less atmospheric, more literal. Rowan, he said quietly, not moving his eyes from the garden's darkness. Walk to the side door slowly. Don't run. I'm not leaving you. That wasn't a suggestion. She took 1 step. 2. She was watching the darkness at the garden's far end, and Marcus was watching it, and neither of them saw the movement that came from the side. From the wall she'd been standing against. From the shadow beside the eastern gate that she'd been next to for 3 minutes without seeing what was in it. She had time to register, a figure, large, dark clothing, moving with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this before. She had time to draw 1 breath to shout. Then something hit the back of her neck. Not a blow, something small and sharp, a sting. And the courtyard tilted sideways, and she heard Marcus shout her name from somewhere that was suddenly very far away. And then the cold stone came up to meet her, and the last thing she saw was the sky above the citadel walls, perfectly clear, the full moon brilliant and merciless, illuminating a world she was being pulled away from. Darkness took her before she could fight it, and in the great hall, 20 feet and one wall away, the king, who had just humiliated the woman he loved, stood with wine drying on his jaw and a handprint on his face, and the first terrible suspicion beginning to move through him. Not quite formed yet, not quite understood, but present the way cold is present before you register you've been exposed to it. The band was still playing. The nobles were still staring. Marcus burst through the side door. His face said everything. The music stopped. Marcus crossed the hall floor in 12 steps, and the room parted for him the way rooms part for someone whose face says that pleasantries are finished. He reached the king and stopped and said 3 words. Rowan is gone. Kael went very still. Not the composed stillness of ceremony, not the controlled stillness of a man managing a room, the other kind, the kind that lives in the body before the mind has caught up. The stillness of a person who has just heard something that has not yet been processed, but whose weight is already landing. Explain, he said. 1 word, flat. Marcus explained in the compressed, precise way of someone who had been a soldier before he was a diplomat. The 2 men he'd spotted, the positions along the east wall, the courtyard, the sound from the garden, and then the side gate swinging open on its hinges, and the courtyard empty, and Rowan gone, and a single dark smear on the stone where she'd hit the ground. He held out his hand while he talked. In his palm was something small. A dart, no longer than his thumb, the tip still faintly discolored. The hall was absolutely silent. Every lord, every noble, every ambassador stood exactly where they were, and the only sound was the wind finding its way through the high windows, and the distant creak of the citadel settling into the cold. Kael looked at the dart in Marcus's palm for a long moment. Then he looked up at the room. The entire court was watching him. Clear the hall, he said. Nobody moved immediately. The paralysis of shock, of a situation outrunning expectation. Now. They moved. Within 20 minutes, the great hall held only the people who needed to be there. Marcus, 3 senior commanders, Lord Aldrich Vale, who had been found in his chambers upstairs and arrived still pulling on his coat, his face the color of old snow, and Harmon Greer, the king's chief advisor, who had been in the hall for the ball and was now standing with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of contained alarm. Kael stood at the head of the table they'd pulled to the room's center. He had changed out of the wine-stained jacket. He had not, Marcus noted, taken time to sit down, and he showed no signs of planning to. Tell me what we know, he said. Marcus laid it out. The dart was professional. The compound on the tip was a fast-acting sedative, the kind used by certain border operatives for captures that needed to be clean and quiet. Not a poison, not a killing tool. This was a taking, not an assassination. The side gate opens to the old servants' road, said Commander Fenn, a hard-faced woman who ran the Citadel's northern garrison. It connects to the lower valley track after a quarter mile. Horses could have been waiting. How long? Kael asked. They had at minimum a 5-minute head start before I raised the alarm, Marcus said. Probably closer to 10. So they're already off Citadel land. Yes. Kael's jaw worked once. Who? It was not a question. It was a demand for confirmation of something he'd already begun calculating. Marcus and Fenn exchanged a look. There's only one party with the resources, the border access, and the specific interest in using her as leverage, Marcus said carefully. The name arrived in the room before anyone said it. Kael said it anyway, because saying it made it real, and real things could be acted on. Volkar. Darius Volkar. Warlord of the Greyvast territories, the contested land beyond the northern border that no crown had formally claimed and no crown had successfully pacified. He had been a problem for 7 years. Not a declared enemy, not a treaty partner, but something worse. A capable and patient man who operated in the spaces between formal rules, who built power through alliances the Northern Court couldn't officially acknowledge, and through actions no diplomat could officially prove. He had probed Kael's border 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time, Kyle had responded with force calibrated precisely to what was needed, and no more, unwilling to give Volkar the full confrontation that the warlord seemed to be angling toward. "Why now?" Lord Aldrich's voice was rough. He was staring at the dart on the table. "Why tonight?" "Because tonight the entire court was assembled in one place and distracted," Harmon Greer said from his corner, with the dry clarity of someone analyzing a problem they didn't personally feel. "And because whoever Volkar had watching the Citadel reported a specific opportunity." He paused. "Lady Rowan left the hall alone, at night, into an open courtyard. It was—" He stopped. "Finish it," Aldrich said. "It was convenient," Greer said. "I'm not suggesting she—" "I know what you're not suggesting," Aldrich said. His voice had a quality in it now that Kyle had never heard from the older man before. Something stripped back, something that was fury operating in very tight quarters. "She left the hall because my king made a spectacle of her in front of every noble in the north." He looked at Kyle. Directly. The room went carefully quiet. Kyle met the older lord's eyes. He didn't look away. He didn't offer the deflection or the qualified statement that would have been the political response. He simply absorbed it, the way you absorb something that is true and that you deserve to hear. "Yes," he said. Aldrich held the eye contact for another moment. Then he nodded. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a man who understood that blame and action were different currencies, and this was not the time for the first one. "Then let's get her back," he said. But the message arrived 2 hours later. A rider, alone, on a horse that had been pushed hard, lathered, blowing, barely managed by the time it reached the Citadel's outer gate. The rider was one of Volkar's men, wearing the gray and black of the gray vast territories, with the specific confidence of someone who knows their mission makes them temporarily untouchable. He handed the sealed letter to the gate guard and said 3 sentences. "For the king. From Lord Volkar. He expects an answer by dawn." The letter was brought to Kyle unopened, and he opened it in the war room with Marcus on his left and Commander Fenn on his right, and Lord Aldrich standing at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the dark. The letter was short. Volkar had always understood economy of language. "King Draven, I have something of yours. I suspect you know what I want in return, not the woman whose value to me is entirely symbolic. What I want is what I have always wanted. You, face to face, blade to blade, in the old valley below the standing stones. Alpha to alpha. Winner takes the northern claim. Come alone or she answers for your cowardice. You have until the 3rd morning. D. Volkar." Kale read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "Alpha duel," Marcus said. "He's been maneuvering toward this for 2 years. He needs the formal challenge to legitimize his claim," Fenn said. "If he wins, every border lord shifts allegiance overnight. If he loses—" She paused. "He doesn't expect to lose." "He's had someone inside the Citadel," Marcus said, "to know the timing, to have men positioned. He's had someone watching for weeks, maybe months." His voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. He knew about Rowan specifically. That's not opportunism. That's preparation. Kale picked up the letter again. He looked at the line, "whose value to me is entirely symbolic," and something moved through him that was not strategic and not composed, and that he did not attempt to manage. "He prepared this as a trap," Greer said from the far end of the table. "An alpha duel fought on his chosen ground, with a hostage to ensure you come alone. Sire, the tactical disadvantages are—" "I'm aware of the tactical disadvantages. The smart response is to send an army, retrieve Lady Vale by force and deny him the confrontation He'll kill her!" The words came out flat and certain, and the room recognized the certainty for what it was. Not emotion, but assessment. "If I send an army instead of a single challenger, she's a liability rather than leverage. He knows that. I know that. The letter is a test." Kale set it down again. "He wants to know if I'll come." "And will you?" Greer asked. The question sat in the room for a moment. "Yes," Kyle said. Greer made a sound of professional distress. Marcus said nothing, which was louder. Commander Fenn looked at the map on the wall with the expression of someone recalibrating their plans. Lord Aldrich turned from the window. His face, in the lamplight, held something that had passed through anger and arrived somewhere older and quieter. "You'll need to ride hard to reach the Standing Stones Valley by the third morning," he said. "The winter track through the Ashenvale Pass adds half a day." He paused. "My daughter is not fragile, but she is also not a soldier. Whatever Volkar's men used on her in that courtyard," his voice caught briefly and then steadied. "She'll be frightened, and she'll be cold, and she'll be managing it alone. She's very good at managing things alone." Something in his tone said this was not entirely a compliment. "Don't make her wait longer than she has to." Kael looked at the older man. "I won't," he said. And then, because some things needed to be said even when they were insufficient, "My lord, what happened tonight in the hall was something we will discuss at length," Aldrich said, "when my daughter is home." He picked up his coat from the chair. "Until then, I suggest you pack warm. Shut." Rowan woke up in stages, which was worse than waking up all at once. The first stage was sound, low voices, the creak of wood, the sound of wind at a higher pitch than she was used to, which meant elevation, which meant the mountains. The second stage was cold, the specific deep cold of stone that had never been warm, seeping up through whatever she was lying on. The third stage was light, gray, diffuse, coming from a high narrow window somewhere above and to her left. The fourth stage was clarity, and with it the full inventory of her situation. She was in a room carved into stone, not built, carved, the walls rough-hewn and ancient, the kind of construction that predated any current border dispute by several centuries. There was a pallet beneath her, rough wool and straw, not cruel but not comfortable. Her hands were not bound. Neither were her feet. There was a lamp in the corner giving off a low, steady light, and a wooden door that was, she confirmed by sitting up and then waiting for the room to stop moving, almost certainly locked. Her neck ached where the dart had hit. She had a headache from the compound, or from the fall, or from both. She cataloged this the same way she'd been taught to catalog everything. Information first, response second. She sat up fully, breathed, assessed. She was not injured beyond the headache and the neck stiffness. She was cold, but not dangerously cold. There was a second blanket folded at the foot of the pallet, and she pulled it around her shoulders with the practicality of someone who grew up on the northern frontier and understood that warmth was a resource, and resources were not wasted on sentiment. She was hungry. She was thirsty. She was, beneath all of it, quite deliberately not afraid. Fear was available. She could feel it at the edges, pressing in. The specific fear of someone who has lost control of their circumstances and who knows enough about the world to understand exactly how badly this could go. She acknowledged it, the way her father had taught her to acknowledge difficult things. Not push it away, not let it expand, just name it and put it where it wouldn't interfere with thinking. "You are afraid." "Yes." "Fine. Now think." The room had one door, one high window, no other obvious exits. The window was too narrow for a person, but not too narrow for sound, which was how she could hear the wind and, if she focused, something else. A rhythmic sound she couldn't identify yet, mechanical, below the range of conversation. The door opened. She stayed where she was, sitting, blanket around her shoulders, spine straight. The man who came in was not what she'd expected, and she was annoyed at herself for having expected anything specific at all, because expectations were another form of vulnerability. He was perhaps 45, dark-haired with silver at the temples, wearing traveling clothes of good quality. Medium height, medium build, and the kind of face that was designed to give nothing away. Controlled in the same way as a weapon is controlled, not through passivity, but through intention. She had never seen Darius Volkar. She recognized him anyway. "Lady Vale," he said. His voice was even, pleasant in the surface way of a man who had learned that pleasantness was more unnerving than threat. "I'm glad you're awake. I apologize for the method of your transportation. It was inelegant." She looked at him. "You could have sent a carriage." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "I wasn't confident you'd have come voluntarily." Reasonable assumption. He moved to the room's only chair and sat in it, which put them at approximately the same level, which was either a courtesy or a calculation. She decided it was both. "You're not frightened," he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm very frightened, she said. I'm managing it. This time it was a real smile, brief and almost genuine. Your father's daughter, he said. She said nothing. He leaned back in the chair with the ease of a man on his own ground. I'm going to explain your situation to you, he said. Not because I owe you an explanation, but because I find that people who understand their circumstances are more predictable, and predictable is easier for everyone. He paused. I sent a message to Cale Draven tonight. I've challenged him to an alpha duel. His title and his northern claim against my territorial rights. Winner takes everything. You are my guarantee that he comes. He'll come, she said. I expect so. Then you have your guarantee. She held his gaze. What happens to me when the duel is finished? That depends entirely on the outcome. She understood what that meant. She kept her face level. And if I tried to leave this room? The door is locked from outside, Volkar said. There are 4 men in the corridor. The window leads to a 40-foot drop onto rock. He paused. I'm not telling you this to intimidate you. I'm telling you because attempting to escape under those conditions would be dangerous to you specifically, and I would prefer you arrive at the end of this situation unharmed. How considerate. It is, actually. Something shifted in his tone, still controlled, but a register lower. I want you to understand something, Lady Vale. This is not personal. You are a political instrument in a negotiation that has been building for 7 years. The King of the North is talented and he is young, and he has held this border against me by being smarter than his age should allow. A pause. But he is also proud, and he is also in love with you, which means he is not, in this moment, thinking as clearly as he might otherwise. That is the condition I intend to use. You've been watching the Citadel, she said, for 4 months. The man at the ball, the one who wasn't a Vandel retainer, he inclined his head. Renwick. Yes, he has been very useful. She absorbed this, turned it over, filed the pieces where they belonged. And the dart compound, fast-acting, no lasting damage. You've been planning this exact operation for some time. Since the beginning of autumn. Why now? Why this week? He looked at her with something that was almost respect. Because the ball was the only occasion in the calendar year when the entire northern court was assembled in one location and the king would be, shall we say, emotionally occupied. He paused. Your public argument with him 2 days ago was not planned, but useful. A king who is angry at the woman he loves is a king whose judgment is compromised. She kept her face completely still. The argument. The library. All of it. Not private at all, apparently. Renwick was thorough, she said. He was. Volkar rose from the chair. I'll have food and water brought to you. The duel will take place in 2 days. The Standing Stones Valley at dawn. By midday, one way or another, this will be concluded. He moved toward the door. I would suggest resting, Lady Vale. You've had a difficult evening. Volkar. He stopped. She met his eyes. When Kyle wins the duel, she said, and she kept the word when clean and certain, no hedging in it at all. This ends. Whatever you're building in the gray vast, whatever network you've put together. When he walks off that valley floor, it ends. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't entirely read. He hasn't won yet, he said. He will. Another pause, then, get some rest. And he was gone. The door locked behind him. Rowan sat in the cold stone room and breathed and thought, and did not let herself fall into the fear that was still pressing at the edges, patient and available. She had 2 days. 2 days in which Kyle would ride across the Ashenvale Pass and into a duel that Volkar had been preparing for 4 months. A duel on the warlord's chosen ground against a challenger who had spent the last 12 hours making decisions driven by jealousy and hurt rather than clear tactical thinking. Against a man who had been watching, planning, and waiting while Kyle spent his autumn managing court politics and a complicated heart. She needed to think. More than that, she needed information. The room had a door she couldn't open and a window she couldn't fit through, and 4 men in the corridor and a 40-foot drop to rock. She had a blanket, a lamp, and the headache from the sedative compound receding slowly. She began going over the room, methodically, with the careful, complete attention she brought to tactical problems. The walls, the floor, the pallet, the lamp, the narrow window she couldn't climb through but that had sound coming in. And sound came from somewhere. The lamp was oil-fed, mounted in a wall bracket. She examined the bracket, iron, old, fixed into the stone at an angle that was not quite level because the stone had shifted over the years. The bracket was set in mortar that was not the original mortar. It had been patched at some point paler than the surrounding wall. She pressed it, applied her weight. It shifted. Not much. A millimeter, maybe 2, but it shifted. She looked at the bracket for a long time. Then she looked at the door. Then at the high window and the gray light coming through it, and the sound of the wind outside that was also the sound of cold air moving across an open rock face. She sat back down on the pallet and pulled the blanket around her again and thought about the standing stones of the Rowan Valley, which she had seen once, as a girl, on a ride with her father in a border patrol. Ancient monoliths arranged in a rough semicircle on the valley floor, the stones of the old bloodlines. The territories went back further than any current border, further than any current crown, to the time when the North was divided by blood right rather than law. She thought about what Volkar had said. The land itself answers to the old bloodlines. And then she thought about something else. Something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd first come fully conscious in this room. Something that she'd been letting assemble itself quietly while she managed Volkar and managed her fear and managed the cold. She thought about what she knew. Renwick had been in the Citadel for 4 months. He had watched the library. He had watched the Eastern Garden. He had watched her and Kyle and Marcus and the entire mechanics of the court's interior life with enough detail to time this operation precisely, which meant he had been somewhere inside the Citadel's trust structure, not on the outside watching in, but close enough to move freely. Staff, or presented as staff, or attached to a household that had Citadel access. She went through the autumn's arrivals in her memory. It was a long list, but she had always been good at lists. She moved through it with deliberate care, pulling faces and names and moments, and stopped. The Vandel household. Mira Vandel's retinue had arrived 6 weeks ago, slightly early for the ball, and had been housed in the Citadel's East Wing, the same East Wing where she and Kael had both been housed, where the library was, where the garden backed up to the outer wall. She had seen Renwick standing near a window the night she'd left the library 3 days ago. She'd registered him as a minor lord. He'd been alone. The Vandel retinue had included, when she went through her memory carefully, a man of his description, compact, forgettable face, rarely spoke in gatherings but always present in the background of the right conversations. Mira Vandel had not just been a ball candidate. Mira Vandel had been cover. Rowan sat with this for a moment and let it become a certainty rather than a theory. Volkar had not simply been watching the Citadel for an opportunity. He had placed an asset inside the most politically convenient household, the one most likely to be invited to exactly this kind of event. And he had been running an intelligence operation against the Northern Court from the inside for months, which meant that whatever information Volkar had about Kael's strengths and weaknesses was not general. It was specific, current, and detailed. It also meant something else, something that mattered. Renwick was still in the Citadel. Tit. She waited until the guard outside her door settled into the pattern she'd been listening for, the particular rhythm of 4 men rotating positions, which created a gap of approximately 90 seconds every 2 hours when all 4 were at the corridor's ends and the middle stretch, where her door was, had no one directly in front of it. She had spent 6 hours listening to them. She had the pattern. She had also spent 6 hours on the lamp bracket. The mortar, when she worked at it steadily with the one tool available to her, a loose iron pin she'd found at the pallet's base, probably a dropped fitting from the original construction, crumbled in a way that suggested it had been applied in a hurry at some point and had not been well maintained since. The bracket itself, when she had enough mortar cleared, pulled free from the wall with a sound she managed by pulling steadily rather than sharply and timing it to the loudest gusts of wind against the exterior wall. She had a 12-inch iron bracket. One end was a wall fitting, irregular and rough. The other end was the curved cradle that had held the lamp. She had the lamp itself, which she'd refilled from the small oil flask beside the pallet, and which was her only light source, and which she was going to have to leave behind because she needed both hands, and she could not bring fire into what she was about to do. She waited. The gap came. She felt it in the pattern of sounds, the footsteps moving to the corridor's ends, the absence of the closer ones. 90 seconds. She went to the door. The lock was a standard iron bar mechanism. She could feel it through the door's gap, the slight resistance when she pressed. She had exactly nothing that would open it from this side, which was why she wasn't going to open it from this side. She went to the window. 40 feet to the rock face below, Volkar had said. She looked out. He was right. 40 feet, straight down, sheer rock glistening with the thin ice that came when temperature dropped below a certain point and the stone's surface moisture froze. Falling was not survivable, but along the window's right side she could see what the room's interior hadn't shown her. The building's outer wall had a seam in it, where an older section of stone met a newer addition, and in that seam, at intervals of approximately 4 feet, were the iron pins that held the two sections together. Old construction. Driven into the stone rather than set in mortar, which meant they had been there for a very long time and had the kind of permanence that came from deep anchoring. The window was too narrow for her body. It was not too narrow for her arms. She stripped the blanket into strips, methodically, quickly, the way you do a thing you've already decided on before your fear can catch up with the logic. She tied them together. She tested the weight on the wall bracket she'd removed, which she then jammed across the window's inner face at its narrowest point, braced at both ends. Then she threaded the blanket strip through the bracket and tied it off and dropped the other end out the window. She went through the window arms first, head forward, until her shoulders jammed at the narrowest point, and then she bent her wrists outward and found the first iron pin with her right hand and pulled. And the stone was cold enough to burn her palms, and the wind at this elevation hit her face like a flat hand. She did not fall. She moved. Slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who was 20 feet off a rock face in a mountain wind with blanket strips as their only equipment, she moved along the building's exterior seam, pin to pin, until she reached the corner. The corner gave her the north face, which gave her less wind and a different view of the compound below. And more importantly, a drainage ledge, 6 inches wide, running the full length of the north face at window level. Old stone infrastructure, solid. 6 inches was enough. She moved. It took 11 minutes. She counted them in her head, not from panic, but from necessity. She needed to know how much time had passed when she reached the far corner and found the sloped section of roof that led down to the outbuilding below, which was accessible without a drop, which meant her landing was controlled. She landed in a hay storage building and stayed still and listened. No shout, no alarm. She moved through the compound in the dark, using the specific skill of someone who had grown up in a fortress, and learned that the best cover was looking like you had somewhere to be. She found the stable at the compound's south end by sound first, horses, always distinguishable, and she was through the stable door and her hands were on the nearest horse's withers before the single sleeping groom had finished waking up. "Don't," she said quietly, and something in her voice, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of wavering, made the young man blink and hold still. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I need this horse, and I need the south gate to be open. Can you do that?" He stared at her. He was perhaps 17, and he was looking at a woman with blanket fibers in her hair and raw palms and the expression of someone who had been making decisions under pressure for the past 8 hours and had no intention of stopping. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She was already bridling the horse. "The south gate. Now, please." She rode through the gray-vast darkness on a horse she didn't know, in a direction she was calculating by the stars because there was no other reference, with raw hands and a headache and the specific cold of the high mountain night pressing in from all directions. She was 2 days' ride from the Standing Stones Valley. Kael would arrive there by the 3rd morning, which meant she had, at best, 36 hours to reach him before the duel. She pushed the horse into a gallop and bent over its neck and focused on the stars and on the terrain opening in front of her and on the single thing she needed to do, get to him before Volkar did. Behind her, the compound alarm bell was beginning to ring, one clear note, then another, then the continuous rolling sound of a search being initiated. It carried far in the mountain air. It would carry to the compound's gates and to the patrol riders and to the four men in the corridor who had just discovered an empty room, a lamp on the floor, and a window with a blanket strip hanging out of it. She did not look back. The horse was fast, and the night was clear, and the mountains were dangerous, and she was riding into them alone. She had never, in 21 years, been more completely herself. The alarm bell behind her faded with distance. Ahead, the dark opened into the high pass, and beyond it, somewhere below the snow line, a valley of ancient stones waited for a duel that was never supposed to happen like this. She leaned lower over the horse's neck and ran. The high pass through the Ashen Vale had a name that the northern frontier families used among themselves, and that never appeared on any official map: the Widow's Throat. It was called that because of its shape, a narrow channel between two ridge faces that compressed the wind into something less like weather and more like intention, a sustained pressure that came at you from three directions at once, and that killed horses if you pushed them through it wrong. The locals knew to go slow in the throat, to hug the eastern wall where a natural shelf broke the worst of the wind, to move at dawn when the temperature differential between the peaks and the valley created a brief window of relative calm. Rowan knew all of this. She had ridden the pass twice, both times in daylight, both times with her father's patrol at her back. She rode it now at 3 a.m, alone, on a horse she'd stolen from a warlord's stable, in the dark. She hugged the eastern wall. She kept the horse at a controlled pace despite every instinct that screamed faster. She read the wind by sound rather than sight, the way her father had taught her. Listen to the pitch, not the volume. Pitch tells you where it's coming from. And she adjusted her line accordingly, pressing into the shelf when the pitch dropped and easing out when it climbed. The horse, to its considerable credit, trusted her. Animals did that occasionally, responded to the specific quality of someone who was frightened but not panicked, who was demanding something difficult but not impossible, and who had the competence to ask for it correctly. She kept her hand steady on the reins and spoke to it in a low, continuous murmur that was partly instruction and partly just the sound of a person being present and calm. And the horse moved through the widow's throat at a careful trot and came out the other side with both of them breathing hard and intact. The valley opened below her as the pass spat them out onto the descending track. She could see it even at this distance. The standing stones. 6 monoliths arranged in their ancient rough semicircle on the valley floor, catching the moonlight in a way that made them look less like rocks, and more like something that had been placed deliberately by hands that understood what they were doing, which was exactly what they were. She'd seen old texts in the Citadel library that described them as boundary markers from before any current bloodline had existed, placed to indicate where different alpha territories had once met and where disputes between them were traditionally settled. She was perhaps 3 hours' ride from the valley floor. She had, if her reading of the stars was accurate, approximately 18 hours before dawn on the third morning. She gave the horse 10 minutes of rest and water from the stream that ran along the pass's lower edge. And then she moved again, descending into the dark with the standing stones ahead of her like a fixed point in a compass. She reached Kyle camp at noon. She smelled it before she saw it: wood smoke and horses, and the particular smell of a group of armed men who had been moving fast and sleeping rough. She came over a low rise and pulled up and looked down at the camp in the tree line below the valley's north approach. And she took a moment to count: 8 horses, 4 tents, 2 sentries walking a perimeter that told her Commander Fenn had sent professionals. The nearer sentry heard her horse at 50 yards and had his hand on his blade at 30. "Lady Rowan Vale," she said clearly, before he could do anything regrettable. "I need to see the king." The sentry stared at her for a long moment. His expression cycled through disbelief and then something more complicated. "My lady," he said carefully, "we were told you were—" "I know what you were told," she said. "I've been riding for 9 hours. Please take me to the king." He took her to the king. She heard Kyle before she saw him. His voice coming from the largest tent, clipped and tense, mid-sentence in what sounded like a tactical discussion. Then the sentry pulled back the tent flap and said her name, and the voice stopped. She stepped inside. He was standing at a camp table with Marcus on one side and Commander Fenn on the other, a map laid out between them with markers indicating positions. He was wearing trail clothes, dark and heavy, no ceremony to any of it, and he had not slept. She could see that immediately, in the particular quality of tension around his eyes, the slight rawness of someone who had been running on necessity rather than rest for too long. He looked at her and went completely still. She had planned what she would say. She had organized it during the ride, built it into a structure. The intelligence about Renwick, the Vandel household connection, the poison she'd overheard Volkar's men discussing in the corridor outside her room when they thought she was still unconscious. She had a logical sequence prepared, prioritized correctly, because the information mattered and it needed to be delivered clearly. What came out was, "You look terrible." Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Commander Fenn looked at the tent wall. Something moved through Kyle's face, the stillness breaking, something behind it surfacing that was too large and too unguarded for the tactical tent and the professional audience. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped directly in front of her and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. His hands came up and held her face, the same way they had in the library, and he looked at her with the focused, detailed attention of someone checking inventory. Her eyes, her jaw, the raw skin of her palms that she hadn't managed to hide, the bruise at the side of her neck where the dart had hit. "You're hurt," he said. "It's minor." "Rowan, I escaped," she said. "I need to tell you what I found out before you do anything else. It's important." His jaw worked. His hands stayed where they were for one more moment, and in that moment she could feel everything he wasn't saying. The weight of the last 16 hours, the thing that had sent him across a mountain pass in the dark, with 8 warriors and a duel on the horizon. She felt it the way you feel weather changing, the pressure of it, and she let herself feel it back for exactly that moment and not one longer. Then she stepped back gently and looked at Marcus and Fenn. Renwick is still inside the citadel. The tent changed quality. Fenn straightened. Marcus set down the marker he'd been holding. Volkar's intelligence asset, Rowan continued, moving to the map table without waiting to be invited. He came in with the Vandel household. He's been there for 4 months. He knew everything. The ball timing, the library, the garden, the East Wing layout. She traced the map with one finger. "He's not a minor operative. He's the source of everything Volkar knows about your fighting style, your schedule, your defenses. If he's still inside the Citadel, he's still transmitting." Marcus looked at Kyle. "The Vandel household was housed in the East Wing," he said. "Access to everything," Kyle said flatly. His voice had shifted into the tactical register shot, the one she'd heard in council chambers, the one that processed information and produced decisions. Council meeting schedules, guard rotations, the location of the library. He paused. "My sparring records." "Fenn, who logs the king's sparring outcomes?" Fenn's expression changed. "The garrison record keeper, who reports to the chief steward, whose office is in the East Wing." She said it with the flat precision of someone identifying a structural failure. "Volkar knows your strongest combinations. He knows where you favor your left and where you telegraph your right. He's been building a counter-strategy for 4 months, Rowan said. "At least." Silence for a moment. Real silence, the thinking kind. "There's more," Rowan said. "I was unconscious when they brought me in, but I came around before they knew it. The men in the corridor were talking." She kept her voice level and precise. "Volkar has a compound, not the sedative, something else. I heard the word winter bleed." The effect of the word was immediate and specific. Marcus went very still. Fenn looked at the king. Kael's expression didn't change, his thumb pressed against his ring finger. She knew what winter bleed was. Everyone on the northern frontier knew what winter bleed was. It was a compound derived from the bark of a specific mountain tree, used by the Highland clans for exactly one purpose. Administered in small amounts to an opponent before combat, it created a gradual and nearly undetectable deterioration of physical capacity. Not a poison in the killing sense. It wouldn't end you. It would simply, over the course of an hour's physical exertion, make you slower, make your muscles burn faster, make the seconds between your instinct and your body's response stretch by a fraction of a fraction. Not enough to be noticeable at rest, catastrophic in a duel. He plans to administer it before the challenge, Rowan said. I don't know how. It can be delivered through water, through food, or through a blade edge. She looked at Kyle. He has been preparing this specific duel for 4 months. He is not walking into that valley to fight fairly. Kale held her gaze. How certain are you about what you heard? Certain enough to ride through the widow's throat at 3 in the morning to tell you. Something shifted in his expression that she didn't have a name for immediately. It was older than gratitude and more complicated than relief. It was the expression of a man who has been shown, at the exact moment when he needed to see it, that his understanding of something was incomplete. He'll use a rider, Marcus said, thinking aloud. A formal delegation under truce flag to present the challenge terms in writing. It's traditional, it's expected, and it gives him a way to get someone close enough to... He stopped. Water. They bring water for the opposing party's horses. It's courtesy protocol. Nobody questions it. So we don't accept water from his delegation, Fen said. We don't accept anything from his delegation, Kael said. We don't use anything that's been on his side of the contact line. He looked at Rowan. Is there anything else? She thought about Volkar in the stone room, the brief smile, the almost respect when she'd told him Kael would win. He's very confident, she said. The kind of confident that comes from preparation rather than arrogance. He has not underestimated you. He's built an entire counter-strategy. You need to give him something he hasn't planned for. Kael looked at the map, then at her, then at the map again. All right, he said. And then, with a directness that was the king at his most stripped back. I'm glad you're here. She held his gaze for a beat. I know, she said. And then, because this was not the time and she was nothing if not practical. Now, tell me the plan. Volker's delegation arrived at mid-afternoon under a white truce flag, as Marcus had predicted. 2 riders, formally dressed, bearing a sealed document that confirmed the duel terms in writing and presenting, with elaborate courtesy, a skin of water for the opposing party's use. Commander Fen, who had been watching their approach from the tree line for 20 minutes, accepted the document with equal formality and declined the water with a smile that revealed nothing. The riders' faces were carefully neutral. One of them glanced, very briefly, toward the camp center where the horses were picketed, and then looked away. Fen watched them ride back down the valley. The one on the left, she said to the sentry beside her. He was checking the water supply. I saw it, the sentry said. Burn our current supply. Fresh water from the stream, collected by our own people, containers that have not left our sight. She turned back toward the camp. And tell the king his read was correct. The morning of the 3rd day came slow and iron gray, the way mornings came in the high valleys when the season was turning, the light arriving without warmth, as though the sun was present only technically, fulfilling an obligation. The standing stones cast long shadows westward across the valley floor, and the frost that had formed overnight on the grass made the ground look like it had been dusted with something ceremonial. By the time Kyle walked down from the tree line with Marcus at his shoulder, and Fen and her 6 soldiers flanking at a distance that respected the duel's protocol, Volkar was already in the valley. He had brought more men, at least 20, positioned along the valley's southern edge with the stillness of people who had been told to hold their positions absolutely. The warlord himself stood before the standing stones in dark fighting clothes, and even across the distance of the valley floor, the quality of his composure was visible. He was very sure of himself. Rowan stood at the tree line's edge with Fen's remaining 2 soldiers and watched Kyle walk down toward the valley floor and felt the particular species of fear that had nothing to do with your own safety, the kind that lives in the chest and presses outward and has nowhere useful to go. She breathed through it. She watched. The 2 men met in the center of the semicircle of stones, and even from 50 yards she could see the contrast. Volkar older, darker, moving with the patient efficiency of someone who had fought in more environments and more conditions than the young king had years. Kyle broader, faster in his bearing, carrying the controlled energy of someone who had been moving toward this moment for 2 days and was now here and ready. The formal exchange. She could hear only fragments at this distance. The traditional declaration of the Alpha Challenge, the terms confirmed, the witnesses acknowledged. She watched Volkar's face during the exchange and tried to read what she'd learned of him in the stone room. The calculation, the controlled pleasantness, the absolute belief in his own preparation. He believed the winter bleed had been delivered. He believed he had walked the king into a narrowing funnel and that the funnel's end was here. He didn't know that Kyle had drunk nothing, eaten nothing, touched nothing that had come within reach of Volkar's men since the delegation yesterday. He didn't know that Rowan had gotten out of that room. He was about to find out what it meant to prepare for a version of events that had already changed. The duel began with blades, which was traditional. Volkar moved first, not aggressively but exploratorily. The opening sequence of a man who was probing, mapping responses, confirming what he already believed he knew. He had studied Kael's combinations for 4 months. He knew the left-hand telegraph. He knew the overcommitment in the third combination, the habit Kael had developed in the training yard and never fully shed. He had built his counter strategy around these specific data points. For the first 2 minutes, he used them, and they worked. Kael's left drew a measured counter that forced a defensive adjustment. The third combination was met before it completed, and Volkar's smile, small and controlled, said clearly that his data was accurate. Then Kael changed. Not dramatically, not a sudden reversal. The change was subtle at first, a different weight distribution, a different entry angle, a modification to the third combination that came 2 beats earlier than Volkar's model predicted. The warlord adjusted because he was good, but the adjustment cost him a fraction of time, and in that fraction Kael's blade found his guard at an angle that hadn't been in any sparring record. Rowan, watching from the tree line, exhaled. She had told him, last night, sitting with the map between them and Marcus quiet in the corner. He knows your training combinations. He's built his entire strategy around them. So don't use your training combinations. Use the ones nobody has ever recorded because they weren't in the yard. They were in the library, in the snow, when we were 10 and 12, and you were still figuring out your own style. The ones you stopped using because they were irregular. He had looked at her for a long moment. You remember my combinations from when we were 12? I remember everything about how you fight, she said. I've been watching you for 15 years. He had been quiet again, then quietly. So have I. Watched you. A pause. I just wasn't allowed to show it. She had not let herself respond to that the way she wanted to. They had a duel to prepare for, but she was thinking about it now, standing in the frost-gray morning, watching him use angles she had described from memory and that Volkar had never seen in any record anywhere because they had been learned in a library in the snow when both of them were children and the world had been very small and very honest. Volkar's next adjustment came slower. The second one after that came slower still. He was recalculating. She could see it in his footwork, the slight increase in caution, the reduction in his reach, the shift from exploratory to defensive that signaled a man whose model was failing. He was good enough to adapt, but adaptation under pressure cost more than preparation, and his preparation was no longer the asset it had been 30 minutes ago. The balance of the duel was moving, slowly, incrementally, like tide rather than wave, but moving. Then Kael's blade opened a cut on Volkar's left forearm, and Volkar's response was not adjustment, it was transformation. The shift happened the way it happened in the old stories, not gradually, but completely, the change running through the warlord's frame like a current. And where a man had been standing, a wolf now stood, massive and dark-coated, shaking off the remnants of constraint with a roll of its shoulders and fixing Kael with amber eyes that held no human calculation, only the older kind. The valley changed. The soldiers on both sides moved back without being told. This was the thing that humans did when alphas shifted, the instinct older than armies or borders. The standing stones seemed to absorb the moment, their shadows shortening as the sun broke briefly through the iron clouds. Kael stood in the center of the stones and looked at the wolf that Volkar had become. And Rowan watched his face from 50 yards, and she saw it, the moment he decided. He had not wanted to shift. She knew this about him. Had known it for years without fully understanding why, the way you know things about people you've been paying close attention to for a long time. The shift was power, but it was also the loss of the particular kind of control he'd spent 9 years building. It was the part of him that was older than the crown, wilder than the court, the part he'd spent a decade managing rather than using. He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, they were not the same color. The shift that moved through him was different from Volkar's. Not the sudden explosion of it, but something that came from deeper, more deliberate, as if the stones themselves were involved in the process. She had heard the old stories her whole life, that the standing stones amplified bloodline power, that alpha transformations performed within the semicircle drew on something older than the individual. She had treated these as folklore, the kind of thing people told themselves to explain what they didn't fully understand. She was revising that assessment. The wolf that Kyle became was larger than Volkar's, not by a small amount. The difference was the difference between a river in drought and a river in flood. The same channel, a wholly different force. The pale gray of his coat caught the morning light, and the standing stones threw shadows that seemed impossibly to lean inward. Volkar's wolf went still. And that stillness was the first moment of something Rowan had not seen from the warlord before. Recalibration of a fundamental kind, not tactical, deeper. The kind that happens when you have built your preparation on an assumption about the nature of what you're facing, and the assumption turns out to be wrong in a way that cannot be corrected. She had told him, in the stone room, he will win. He had not believed her. He was believing her now. What followed lasted 11 minutes by the position of the sun, which was how Rowan measured it, and which was both much shorter and much longer than it felt. She would not be able to describe it afterward with the detail that the watching soldiers would describe it. She was too far away, and also she was watching with the part of her that was not analytical, the part that had been watching him since she was 6 years old, and that was not, in this moment, available for objective reporting. What she saw was this: 2 wolves in the circle of ancient stones, and the valley doing something she could not explain. And Volkar's wolf, which was not unimpressive and was fighting with everything it had, slowly losing the ground it was trying to hold. Not cleanly. There was blood on both sides, and there were moments when the outcome was not obvious, when Volkar's experience and preparation found angles that the larger wolf had to work to counter. He was very good. He had not been wrong to believe in his own capabilities. He had simply been wrong about one specific thing. He had believed the King of the North was operating at reduced capacity. He had believed the winter bleed had been delivered, and that the advantage was his, and that the preparation had held. It had not held, because a woman had gotten out of a stone room using a lamp bracket and a strip of blanket, and ridden through a mountain pass in the dark to say, "Don't drink the water." It was, in the final accounting, a very small thing, one conversation, one piece of information carried across the Ashen Vale on a stolen horse. It was also everything. The moment of submission came suddenly, after a long sequence of diminishing returns on Volkar's part. A loss of ground that became a loss of position, that became a final, definitive pinning Kyle's jaws at the warlord's throat with the exact controlled pressure that said, "This is over, and we both know it, and the only remaining question is whether you are going to be intelligent about it." Volkar's wolf went still, lay flat, throat exposed. The valley was absolutely silent. Kyle stepped back, a breath of space, enough to let the warlord find his footing, enough to allow what came next to happen with some shred of dignity intact. He understood what a submission required from the winner as well as from the loser, and he gave it, which was itself a kind of statement to every person watching from both sides of the valley. The shift back was quieter, and when Kyle stood again in human form, bleeding from a gash along his left side that she had not been able to see clearly, in the wolf's coat, which was going to be the next immediate problem, she was already making notes. He looked across the valley floor at the assembled witnesses from both sides, and said, in a voice that carried to every person present, the traditional words of the Alpha Duel's conclusion. "It is decided. The northern claim stands. Lay down your challenge." Volkar, shifting back beside him, was breathing hard. His face had the specific quality of a man who has lost a thing he believed was his and is now processing what that means. He was not, Rowan thought, a small person in the way that some people were small when they lost. She had understood this about him in the stone room. He was capable of recognizing reality. He looked at Kyle for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the particular brevity of a man choosing what the gesture will mean. "The challenge is laid down," he said. "The field is yours. Kyle looked at him. "Your men inside my citadel," he said. "I want them gone by nightfall." Volkar met his gaze. "Done." Marcus was already moving down the valley slope. Fenn's soldiers were reorganizing. Volkar's men across the valley were standing down with the specific, careful quality of people who have just watched something that changes the structure of how they understand the world they're in. Rowan walked down from the tree line. She was not running. She was walking with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had been riding for 9 hours and escaping from a stone room and managing a mountain pass and spending the night in a camp tent explaining old sparring combinations from memory, and who was now simply going to where she was needed next, which was wherever he was. Marcus reached Kale first and was already assessing the gash on his side. Kale said something to him that she couldn't hear, and Marcus stepped back. Not far, but back. And then Kyle looked up and found her, the way he'd always found her in crowded rooms, with the immediate accuracy of someone who had been tracking a specific point in space without admitting it. She stopped in front of him. He was bleeding and exhausted, and there was blood in his hair and frost on his coat, and he looked, standing in front of the standing stones in the gray morning light, exactly like himself. "You're hurt," she said. "You mentioned that earlier." It was still true earlier. She looked at the gash. "Let Marcus see to that." In a minute, she looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression she still didn't quite have a name for, the one that had been living behind the composure for years, and that was not, in this particular moment, behind anything. "Rowan," he said. His voice was very quiet. "What you did? Anyone would have—" "No," he said. "They wouldn't have." He stopped, breathed. "I made decisions last night, before you were taken. I made decisions in that hall that were—" He stopped again, and she could see the exact cost of this, the deliberate setting aside of the control that made apology feel like exposure. "I was wrong. About Marcus. About what I saw. About his jaw. About a great many things." She held his gaze. "I know. I'm not finished. I know that too." His eyes were very steady on hers. "I put you in danger, not directly, not intentionally, but the circumstance that drove you out of that hall." He stopped. "That was mine. And I will not—" He closed the remaining distance between them by one step, and his voice dropped to something that was not for the valley, or the soldiers, or the standing stones, or anyone except her. "I will spend whatever time you will give me, making certain you understand how wrong I was. About what I feel. About what I was too proud to say. About you." The valley was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she had known for 15 years, and loved for 10, and waited for in silence across 8 years of courts and libraries and training yards and crowded halls. "That," she said, "is going to be a long conversation." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware." She allowed herself finally to let the smile happen. Not the court smile, not the managed one, the real one, the one that reached her eyes, the one that was only ever for him. "Then let Marcus look at your side first," she said. "I need you functional for long conversations." He laughed. It was the real laugh, the one from the library, the one that reached his eyes, the one that was only ever for her. Marcus, who had been waiting with the professional patience of a man who had known this was coming for approximately 7 years, stepped forward with the medical kit. Across the valley, the warlord's men were beginning to move. The stones cast their long shadows in the thin morning light. The frost on the valley grass was already softening as the sun broke fully through the last of the clouds, turning the world briefly, brilliantly, gold. Rowan stood in the circle of ancient stones and watched Marcus tend to the wound on Kael's side, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular kind of warmth that comes not from things being perfect, but from things being, at last, honest. The duel was over. The valley had decided. But between her and the man standing 12 feet away, being irritable about being stitched up in the cold, the real conversation, the one that mattered, the one that would take not a morning, but a lifetime, had barely begun. And she was, for the first time in 8 years, not afraid of it. Marcus worked quickly and without commentary, which was one of the things Rowan had always appreciated about him. He cleaned the gash on Kael's side with the efficiency of someone who had done this before under worse conditions, applied the field dressing from the kit with the kind of focused attention that precluded conversation, and then stepped back and said, 6 stitches when we reach shelter. Don't twist left until then, with the tone of a man who knew the instruction would be partially ignored and was noting it for the record. Kael said, noted, in the tone of a man who intended to partially ignore it. Marcus looked at Rowan. She looked back. The shared communication of 2 people who had arrived by different routes at the same understanding of a third. They broke camp within the hour. Fen had already organized the practical elements, the horses, the supply distribution for the return ride, the positioning of the soldiers. She did it with the compressed efficiency of someone who had received unexpected news and processed it by making everything around her more orderly. When Rowan approached to help with the supply packing, Fen handed her a bundle without comment and then said very quietly, while they were both occupied with rope and canvas, I want you to know that every person in this camp rode through the night without complaint. Rowan looked at her. Because he didn't sleep, Fen said. Not the first night. He sat outside the command tent and Harmon Greer came out at some point around 2 in the morning to tell him that the sensible thing was to rest before riding, and the king told him. She paused, a very small compression at the corner of her mouth. Told him something I will not repeat because it was not particularly diplomatic. And then he sat there until first light, and then he packed, and then he rode. She tied off the bundle. I thought you should know. Rowan looked at the camp's organized activity. At Kael across the clearing, speaking with 2 of the soldiers, one hand pressed against his side in the specific way of someone respecting a freshly dressed wound while pretending they are not. At the standing stones visible through the tree line, catching the midday sun now, ancient and unhurried in the way of things that have watched a great deal of human urgency and outlasted all of it. Thank you, she said quietly. Fen nodded once and moved on. But the ride back through the Ashen Vale was different from the ride in. They had light and they had numbers, and they had the particular atmosphere that settles over a group of people when the thing they were moving toward has concluded, and concluded well, not relaxation exactly because they were still on a mountain pass in the cold, but the loosening of a specific tension, the thing that lives in the body when it has been prepared for a worse case that did not come. Rowan rode near the column's center and let herself, for the first time in 3 days, simply exist without a next immediate problem to solve. Her hands still ached from the stone room's exterior wall. Her neck was stiff. She had a headache that came and went in waves, the sedative compound's last departure gift. She was cold in the way that mountain cold got into you after extended exposure. Not dangerously, but pervasively, living in the joints and the shoulders. She felt, despite all of this, remarkably well. Kael rode at the column's head with Marcus, which was appropriate and also predictable, because he would not ride protected while his soldiers rode exposed regardless of the gash in his side, and she knew this about him, and had long since made her peace with it. Occasionally she could see his face and profile when the track curved. The controlled focus of the ride, the way his eyes moved across the terrain with the attention of someone who would not fully exhale until they were through the pass. Once, on a straight section of track where distance was briefly nothing between them, he looked back and found her, and the look that crossed his face was very private and very brief, and she carried it in her chest for the rest of the pass like something warm. They came through the widow's throat in the early afternoon with the wind manageable and the sky holding and the citadel visible in the distance below. Gray stone and iron towers and the banners of the north snapping in the cold air, ordinary and familiar, and in this moment, precisely beautiful. She had grown up in that building. She had spent her childhood in its yards and its libraries and its corridors. She had loved it and chafed against it and understood it and been shaped by it in ways she was still discovering. She looked at it from the pass's high exit and thought about the woman who had left it 3 days ago in a green gown with her hair up and her heart in her throat, walking into a ball she knew was going to break something. She thought about what had broken. She thought about what the breaking had revealed. She rode down the mountain toward home. They reached the citadel at dusk, and the gate was open and lit, and the whole yard was present. Not formally. not in the arranged, processional way of official returns. It was the organic gathering of a place that had been holding its breath and heard it was finally allowed to exhale. Servants who had found reasons to be near the yard, soldiers off duty who had simply come to see, stable hands and kitchen staff, and the castle's ordinary population, filling the space with the noise and warmth of people who had been worried and were now being relieved of it. Lord Aldrich was at the front of the yard. He looked older than she had ever seen him, the 3 days visible in his face with the specificity of a particular kind of waiting, the kind that lives in the body and pays a physical toll. When she dismounted, he crossed the yard and folded her into his arms without speaking, and she held on to him and breathed the familiar smell of pipe smoke and worn wool and let herself, for exactly the length of that embrace, be 6 years old again. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question. His voice was rough. "I'm all right," she confirmed. "You escaped from a warlord's mountain fortress." "I had tools." He pulled back far enough to look at her. His eyes were very steady, and in them was everything he had spent 3 days not saying, the fear and the pride and the particular grief of a parent who has sent a child into the world and watched the world be the world. "Using what?" he said. "You had nothing." "A lamp bracket and a wool blanket," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. A short, real sound, the laugh of a man being ambushed by something that is both terrible and magnificent simultaneously. "Your mother," he said, "would have done exactly the same." She had not heard him say that in years. Something tightened in her chest and released. "I know," she said. He tucked her under his arm and looked across the yard to where Kael was being intercepted by 3 advisors and Harmon Greer, who had apparently spent the return time preparing a debriefing of considerable scope. "He rode without sleeping," Aldrich said quietly. "I know." "Fen told you?" "Yes." Her father was quiet for a moment. Around them the yard hummed with the ordinary noise of return. Horses being handed off, soldiers dispersing, the practical logistics of a small company's reintegration into a larger place. "Rowan," he said. "What happens now?" She looked across the yard. Kael had extracted himself from Greer's orbital pull. She could see the specific maneuver, practiced, apologetic in its surface and immovable underneath, and was now looking back at her across the crowded yard. "A conversation," she said. The conversation did not happen that night. That night was for other things. For Marcus to administer the 6 stitches in proper conditions, for food and warmth, and the kind of sleep that comes after the body has been pushed past its ordinary limits and is no longer interested in negotiation. Rowan ate in her chambers and slept for 11 hours and woke to find that her hands had stiffened overnight into a state that made the very cold morning that much more personally eventful. She spent the morning in the lower library. She was not hiding. She told herself this clearly and without ambiguity. She was in the library because the library was where she had always gone to think, and there was a great deal to think about, and the fire was well built, and the chair was good, and the books were old friends even when she wasn't reading them. She was also, she admitted to herself somewhere around mid-morning, giving him the chance to come to her. He had said, "In the valley, I will spend whatever time you will give me." Those were not small words. They were not the words of a man who intended to return to his previous operating procedure. She believed him. She had always been able to tell when he meant what he said. It was one of the specific skills 15 years of paying attention produced. But belief and certainty were different registers, and she was, for perhaps the last time, allowing herself the privacy of uncertainty before whatever came next. She heard his footsteps at 11. He came in the same way he always had, since they were children, without announcement, as though the library's geography included him, as though there was no version of this room that did not also contain him. She heard the door, heard the particular weight of his step on the old stones, heard him settle into the chair across the table. She did not look up from her book for a moment. Let the room settle around them. Let the fire do what fires do, and the light come through the high windows the way it always had, gray and clean and northern. Then she set the book down. He looked better than he had in the valley. Rested, color returned, the particular vitality of someone whose body had been given what it needed and responded accordingly. He was in plain clothes, no ceremony to any of it. His eyes were very clear. He had something in his hands. She looked at it before she looked at him. An object, small, which he set on the table between them. An old iron ring, dark with age, set with a single dark blue stone. She knew it. She had seen it in the Citadel's portrait hall, on the hand of the king who had built this room, 3 generations back. She looked up at him. "That ring," she said carefully, "is the Draven betrothal ring." "Yes," he said. "It's been in the family vault for 40 years. I had it brought out this morning." She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "Kael." "I know," he said. "I know the timing. I know what happened 3 days ago in this room, and what happened the night after, and what I did in the hall, and what it cost." He held her gaze with the specific directness that was the most honest thing about him, the thing that lived underneath all the composure and couldn't finally be managed away. "I'm not asking you to overlook any of that. I'm asking you to let me say what I should have said in this room 3 days ago, before all of it, because I was too—" He stopped. Jaw. "Because I was a coward about it. About you." She kept her eyes on his and said nothing. "I have been in love with you," he said, and his voice was very steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held a long time and are finally being set down. "Since I was old enough to understand what that word meant, I watched you grow up alongside me, and I told myself it was the wrong time, the wrong circumstance, the wrong political reality, and all of those things were true and none of them were the actual reason." He paused. "The actual reason is that you see me. The real version. Not the king, not the crown, not the performance I've spent 9 years perfecting. You see all of it, and you say the true thing anyway, even when the true thing is not what I want to hear, and that—" Something moved through his expression. "That terrified me. Being known that completely by one person meant that one person could break you in a way that nothing else can, and I chose," he said, "over and over, not to risk it, because it was safer to keep you at arm's length than to be honest and find out you didn't." "Kael," she said. He stopped. "I threw wine on you in front of your entire court," she said. "Yes. That is not the behavior of someone who doesn't feel anything." Something in his face fractured briefly into something younger. "No," he agreed. "I'm aware of that. I rode through the widow's throat at 3 in the morning. Also noted. I escaped from a mountain fortress with a lamp bracket. Rowan, I'm making a point," she said, "which is that I have been demonstrating in various ways for a very long time that I am not going anywhere. I told you, in this room, 3 days ago, what I felt. I meant it then. I mean it now." She looked at him across the old table with the fire between them and the winter light coming through the windows and 15 years of mornings and libraries and snow and sparring and silences and the particular kind of love that grows when it has no other option but to become very deep. "I am not asking you to risk something," she said. "I am telling you that it is not a risk. I am here. I have always been here." He was very still. She looked at the ring on the table between them, then at him, and she said more quietly, "Ask me properly." He reached across the table. He picked up the ring. He stood and came around the table and went down on one knee in the lower library of Draven Citadel, in plain clothes in the morning light, in the room where they had spent 100 rainy afternoons talking about maps and wars and everything that mattered. "Rowan Vale," he said, "will you stand beside me? Not behind the crown, not underneath it, beside it. As my equal and my queen, and the only person in this kingdom I have never been able to fool into thinking I was more than I am." He paused. One breath. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for exactly the amount of time it took to let the moment fully arrive. Then she said, "Yes, obviously." He laughed. The real laugh, the library laugh, the one that changed his entire face. And he put the ring on her hand, and she pulled him up, and the distance between them closed in the way it had been trying to close for 10 years. And the fire burned, and the light came through the old windows, and the room held all of it, the way it had always held everything they'd said to each other in it, quietly and without judgment. Shit. The announcement was made that afternoon. Not with particular fanfare. Kael had never been a man for elaborate ceremony when plain statement served, and Rowan was even less so. He gathered the court's senior members in the great hall, and he stood at the front of it with Rowan beside him, and said, in the carrying voice that filled rooms without trying, "Lady Rowan Vale will be my queen. The betrothal is formal and final. I will take no other counsel on the matter." The last sentence was pointed and intentional. She noted it. The reaction was not unanimously warm. She had expected this and watched it with the calm attention of someone reading a tactical map. Harmon Greer's face was the face of a man performing rapid recalculations. Several of the senior lords exchanged looks that contained negotiations she would need to learn the specifics of. Lady Ashford, in the room's back quarter, wore an expression of serene composure over something more complicated, and Rowan made a mental note about that for later. But there were other reactions, too. Commander Fenn, standing to the right side of the hall, gave a single deliberate nod that was as close to approval as Fenn's face was capable of producing. Several of the younger lords and ladies who had been in the hall on the night of the ball had the expressions of people watching something they had expected, and not been wrong to expect. And Lord Aldrich, standing near the hall's center, was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man who has spent 3 days being afraid and is now being given back something he thought he might have lost, and who has no word for what he feels and doesn't particularly need one. After the gathering dispersed, slowly, in the way of gatherings that contain more conversation than they're showing, she found Marcus. He was in the corridor outside the hall, waiting with a cup of tea that he had apparently acquired with the efficiency of a man who had known approximately what the morning contained and had planned accordingly. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He handed her the tea. She took it, and they stood in the corridor while the court flowed around them, and she thought about what he'd said the night of the ball. He doesn't look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching. And she thought about Fenn's quiet words in the camp, and she thought about all the people who had been paying attention to something that she and Kyle had both been pretending wasn't there for a very long time. "You knew," she said. "How long?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "Since the sparring yard," he said. "When you were both about 12. He started adjusting his combinations to be harder for you specifically, and I thought, that's not how you spar with someone you regard as a practice partner." He paused. "That's how you spar with someone you're trying to impress." She closed her eyes briefly. "I did not need to know that." "You did, actually." Something in his voice was warm. "Because it means he has been trying, in the specific limited language available to him, to show you something for a very long time. He simply had no idea you already knew." She thought about that. About a boy in a training yard, 12 years old, making his combinations harder for one specific person. About a king who referenced her opinions in council meetings without using her name. Who remembered what she thought about frontier policy. Who found her across crowded rooms with the immediate accuracy of someone who had been tracking a specific point in space for a decade. "He's going to be insufferable about it," she said. "Absolutely," Marcus agreed. "He's already ordered the royal chambers reorganized." She looked at him. "This morning," he said, "before he went to the library. He told Godwin the rooms needed to be reconsidered for—" He paused, visibly selecting words. "For someone who prefers practical furniture and dislikes excess decorative elements. Godwin looked like he might require medical attention." She drank her tea and looked at the hall's closed doors and thought about Godwin's face and felt something in her chest that was warm and uncomplicated and entirely new. Tick. 3 days later, Renwick was found. He had not, as Volcar had promised, gone quietly. He had apparently made 3 attempts to leave the Citadel by different routes, each of which suggested someone who knew the building's exits thoroughly and who underestimated how thoroughly Commander Fenn's people knew them better. He was taken in the East Corridor, the same corridor where Rowan had stood 3 days before the ball and heard Kyle's voice and made her decision, by 2 of Fenn's soldiers who had been waiting in specific positions for 6 hours. He was brought to Kyle's study in restraints, and Kyle conducted the interview with the specific, unhurried quality that was his most effective interrogation mode. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply very patient and very clear about how this was going to go. Rowan was present. She had been present at border investigations before, in her capacity as her father's analytical resource, and she understood these proceedings. She sat in the corner and was quiet and paid attention. Renwick confirmed everything she had deduced from the stone room. The Vandel connection. The 4 months of intelligence gathering, the winter bleed plan, the compound's delivery method. It had been intended for the water brought for the horses, administered in a concentration that was undetectable by smell, and that would not have cleared Kyle system before the duel. He also confirmed something that had not yet been established. He had been Volkar's asset inside the Northern Court, not for 4 months, but for 2 years. He had moved through 3 different household attachments before the Vandel appointment, each one giving him access to a different section of the Citadel's information structure. When Kyle asked him, at the end of the interview, why he had chosen this work, Renwick looked at him with the flat clarity of someone who has passed through the phase of strategic calculation and arrived at something more fundamental. Because Volkar pays well and asks no questions about who you used to be, he said. Kyle looked at him for a long moment. What did you used to be? Someone who made choices I couldn't undo, Renwick said, and needed a long way from them. The room was quiet. I understand that, Kyle said. It was not sympathetic in the soft sense. It was something more careful, the acknowledgement of a man who had spent 9 years making choices and understanding their costs. It doesn't change what you did. No, Renwick agreed, it doesn't. He was taken to holding and would face formal proceedings. Rowan watched him go and thought about the stone room and the cold and the lamp bracket and the 9 hours on a stolen horse, and then she thought about something Volkar had said. You are a political instrument in a negotiation. She had understood even then that he was right, but she had also understood something he hadn't, that instruments, when they are also people, have the specific advantage of agency. She had used it. The proceedings for Renwick were handled quickly and fairly, which was the only way Kyle knew how to handle anything. The Vandel household was formally interviewed. Mira Vandel herself was cleared of knowledge and visibly shaken to understand what had been moving within her retinue, and the security review that Fenn had been quietly lobbying for 6 months was finally, unambiguously approved. The northern border, in the weeks that followed, went through a realignment that the diplomatic correspondence would describe as a renegotiation of territorial recognition terms, and that was more accurately described as every border lord between the Citadel and the Greyvass waking up and reconsidering who they were backing. Volkar had lost the duel in the valley. He had lost Renwick. He had lost the intelligence network and the winter bleed plan and the specific advantage of Kyle not knowing what was coming. He had not, Rowan suspected, finished being a problem. A man like Volkar did not simply stop, but the immediate threat had been removed, the advantage had shifted, and the northern border was more legible now than it had been in 7 years. She said as much, in a meeting in the war room where Fenn was presenting the new border assessment, and when she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then Fenn said, "Agreed," and moved on to the next item, and Rowan noted that nobody in the room looked surprised that she had spoken, or looked to the king to validate what she'd said. She noted this carefully and said nothing about it, and found that it sat in her chest like warmth. The betrothal ceremony was held at the end of the month, in the great hall where 3 weeks earlier she had thrown wine on a king. She dressed herself, as she had for the ball, with the deliberate independence of a woman who had always been good at managing her own affairs. Her gown this time was the color of the deep blue of winter midnight, not chosen for symbolism but because it suited her, and because she had finally, at 21 years old, arrived at the decision that her choices would be made for the correct reasons and not for what they communicated to the people watching. Her father came to her chambers before the ceremony. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, the specific look of a parent seeing something that has been in the process of becoming for a very long time and has now arrived. "Your mother would have had opinions about the dress," he said. "Probably." "They would have been wrong," he added. She smiled. "Probably." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked. The hall looked different this time, so same walls, same chandeliers, same northern winter light pressing against the high windows. But the atmosphere was its own opposite. The court was assembled in the same arrangement as 3 weeks ago, and the memory of that night was present in the room the way all significant memories were present in places that had held them. Not loudly, but available, a layer of meaning underneath the current moment. She walked in on her father's arm, and the hall was quiet with the specific quality of assembled attention, and she did not look at the floor or at the walls, but straight ahead, with the directness that had been her distinguishing quality since she was 6 years old, in a carriage looking out at a boy in the snow. Kael was at the hall's center. He watched her walk toward him with the expression she now had a name for, the one she'd been watching appear and disappear behind composure for 8 years, that had been visible in the library and the valley, and the morning after with the old ring on the table, the one that was only ever for her, that said, "There you are. I see you. I have always seen you." She reached him and stopped. Her father placed her hand in the king's with the formal gesture that the ceremony required, and that managed, in this specific instance, to be both traditional and exactly right. Kael looked at her hand in his, then at her face. "You're not nervous," he said quietly. Observation, not surprise. "No," she said. "I am," he said. "Slightly." She looked at him. The king of the north, alpha of the Draven bloodline, the man who had won a duel in a valley of ancient stones 2 weeks ago and who had, since that morning, reorganized the royal chambers to accommodate someone who preferred practical furniture, was telling her he was nervous, in plain language, in front of his entire court. "I know," she said. "You always press your thumb against your ring finger." He looked down. His hand, which had been resting against hers, had been doing exactly that. He looked back up at her with an expression of genuine vulnerability, not the managed kind, not the performed kind, but the actual kind, the kind that costs something and is given anyway. "How long have you known that?" he asked. 9 years, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "I have been a very significant fool." "Yes," she said. "But you got here." "We got here," he corrected. "We got here," she agreed. The ceremony proceeded. The words were said, the formal words that sealed the betrothal under Northern law. The witnesses signed, the court acknowledged. And when the last word had been spoken and the hall gave the response that tradition required, Kyle turned to face the assembled court and spoke in the carrying voice, the deliberate one. "The North has stood for 300 years, not because its kings were perfect, but because the people around them were honest enough to hold them accountable." He paused. "Rowan Vale has held this court accountable since the day she arrived in it. She will do so as queen more effectively than she did as a noblewoman. And if that troubles anyone in this hall, I suggest they consider what the alternative looks like." Another pause. "She is not here because of tradition or politics or convenience. She is here because she is the most capable and courageous person I have ever met, and because I spent a decade being afraid of that." He looked at her. "I'm done being afraid of it." The hall was quiet for a moment. Then Finn started it. The commander's short, decisive acknowledgement, the sound of someone who has assessed a situation and arrived at a position. Then Marcus from the side of the room with the particular warm steadiness that was his natural register. Then the younger lords, then the soldiers, then the court in the spreading way of genuine response rather than performed one. Lord Aldrich, in the crowd's center, was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man who has given a child everything he could give and watched them become more than any of it, and who has no words for that and doesn't need them. She heard it and felt it and stood in the center of the great hall of Draven Citadel and looked at the man beside her, who was looking back with the open, unguarded face of someone who has put down a very heavy thing and found that their hands still work. "You know," she said quietly, under the noise of the hall, "you are going to have to ask Greer to revise every political alliance document he's drafted for the last 2 years. Kael's expression was that of a man who has already considered this and made his peace with it. "I spoke to him this morning." "How did that go?" "He required 3 cups of tea and a reassurance that the frontier policy framework was not also being reconsidered." She looked forward to restrain the laugh. "Was it?" "Parts of it," he said. "I had some notes." "From who?" He looked at her sideways. "I believe you left a document in the lower library approximately 6 months ago outlining a more effective approach to the Highland clan negotiations." She stared at him. "You read that?" "I read everything you leave in the lower library," he said, with a complete lack of embarrassment that suggested he had decided, somewhere around the Standing Stones Valley, that honesty was the only remaining viable operating mode. "I've been reading things you leave in the lower library for 5 years." She thought about 5 years of documents. She thought about the specific opinions she had committed to paper and what she had believed was private analysis. "That is a significant invasion of—" "I implemented 3 of them," he said. She stopped. "The Eastern Trade Route reorganization in the 3rd year of my reign," he said. "The garrison rotation system that Fen presented as her own idea, but that she will, if pressed, admit came from a document she found on the library table that bore no name. And the Highland Clan preliminary contact protocol that your father has been managing for the past 18 months. He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering an accounting he owes. "I used your work and I did not acknowledge it, and I am telling you this now because you will figure it out eventually anyway, and I would rather you hear it from me." The hall was still celebrating around them, the noise of it surrounding them without intruding. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 policy frameworks she had spent considerable time on, thinking they were theoretical exercises. She thought about the Highland Contact Protocol that her father had brought to her proudly as his own initiative, that she had thought was a coincidental alignment with her own thinking. "Kyle," she said. "Yes. You are going to have a very interesting time as my husband." He held her gaze. Something in his expression was rueful and warm, and not the slightest bit sorry. "I am aware," he said. She looked at the hall around them, at the court that had watched her grow up, and watched her be overlooked, and watched her throw wine on the king, and watched her return from a mountain fortress, and was now watching her stand at the center of its world with the old betrothal ring on her hand and the king of the north at her side, and her father somewhere in the crowd not bothering to hide the tears on his face. She thought about the girl in the carriage with her face against the frosted window, watching a boy in the snow hold out his hand. She thought about the library and the training yard and the years of silence that had not been absence but accumulation. Everything becoming, slowly and inevitably, this. She thought about the widow's throat at 3 a.m, and the stone room, and the iron pins on the exterior wall, and the horse she'd stolen, and the stars she'd navigated by, and the valley where ancient stones stood in a semicircle that was older than any current claim, and that had remembered, in the end, where power actually lived. She thought about what it meant to know someone completely, to be known completely back, to have been afraid of that and done it anyway, not because it was safe, but because the alternative was a life spent standing at the edge of the one true thing and calling the distance between them sensible. The fire in the great hall burned high, and the candles burned steady, and the wind pressed against the citadel walls outside with its customary flat patience, and the north celebrated. She was where she had always been going. She had simply, finally, arrived.